Okay, hello everybody. I was really pleased to be asked by Lindsay to introduce today my friend and colleague, Farah Hussain. Farah is researching her PhD here at Queen Mary and has also been leading work through the Mile End Institute. We worked together on a project which was looking at the public's priorities, policy priorities after the pandemic, or coming out of the pandemic, and Farah has managed polling projects understanding the views and priorities of Londoners. Having also been a councillor in Redbridge, which as a cabinet member, Farah worked on programmes which, amongst other things, delivered new council homes. Farah's knowledge of policy and politics is extensive. As an academic, Farah is undoubtedly a source of creativity, ideas, and expertise, and is a brilliant colleague here at Queen Mary. So, I'm going to hand over to Farah. She's going to speak for around 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for a Q&A. Over to Farah.
Thank you. Thank you, Carl. There we go. So I'm really grateful to be here this afternoon and to be able to share with you my research into Muslim women's experiences in the Labour Party and what I think it means for the relationship between the Labour Party and the Muslim community going forward. In today's presentation, I'll introduce a case study at the centre of my research, discuss the questions that it raises, give a brief overview of the theoretical framework intersectionality that I'm using. I'll concentrate on one of the aspects of the issue that I'm examining. That's the relationship between the Labour Party and British Muslims, the electoral relationship, that's Muslims as voters, and Muslims in the Labour Party, that's Muslims as Labour Party members. I argue that if the Labour Party wants to maintain its position as the party of choice for British Muslims, it needs to find a new way of engaging with the community. It needs to go beyond traditional kinship networks and start treating the community as it does others. I'll start off with what the literature tells us about the dynamic between the party and the community over the last 70-odd years, before moving on to my interview data and what that tells us. I'll share with you some of the recommendations that I have for the party after that. When I started preparing for this lecture, I sent Lindsay a slightly panicked email asking what historians are interested in, and she basically replied with the word history. So I hope I've managed to get the right mix of present, past, and future in this presentation, and if not, you can ask me horrible questions at the end. Right, so in early 2016, an episode of Newsnight was aired, which had a segment on Muslim women's experiences in the Labour Party. Fawzia Parveen spoke of a smear campaign against her during a local government selection contest. Muslim men in her local Birmingham Labour Party had turned up at her parents' home and tried to intimidate her mother to stop Parveen from standing for selection. They claimed that she was having an affair with an existing councillor and therefore wasn't fit to represent the Labour Party. Shazia Bashir, a party member in Peterborough, spoke of how Muslim men in her local party made her step aside in a selection contest because, despite being 31 years old, she didn't have her dad's support to stand. These women were supported by the Muslim Women's Network on the BBC programme, which is an organisation which runs a helpline and supports Muslim women across a number of different areas of their lives. These women and MWN discussed how they felt some local Labour parties had been taken over by kinship networks called biradari. Biradari, meaning brotherhood in Urdu and Punjabi, are networks of mainly older, well-connected Pakistani men who support each other in their endeavours, including in the Labour Party. Women are excluded from these groups and are therefore often at a disadvantage when it comes to selection as candidates in these areas. The women Newsnight spoke to implied that the Labour Party knows about this issue, but had decided to actively not take any action. This accusation and the Labour Party's response to the programme, which was to issue a weak statement claiming that its processes are fair, democratic, and robust, and that it was committed to making sure that all candidates represent the areas, are representative of the areas that they seek to represent, really piqued my interest in this issue. The party didn't acknowledge the women's specific complaints and experiences. And soon the issue was forgotten, the press moved on, and nothing was done to support Muslim women in the Labour Party. I wanted to find out why the party had decided not to investigate this issue more thoroughly. Surely, the party that calls itself the Party of Equality would want to be a welcoming place for Muslim women. The case also puts into the spotlight the relationship between a political party and its members, which those of you who are members of a party know can be a complex one. And it also raises question about how the Labour Party interacts with the Muslim community in the UK. I knew from my own experience that the issue highlighted on Newsnight wasn't one that was just about individual experiences. It went beyond that. And it pointed to a wider pattern of behaviour within the Labour Party. So I was a Labour councillor, local councillor until this May, and am a Muslim woman. And I know of other Muslim women in the Labour Party who have experienced similar discrimination. And in fact, the Labour Party Democracy Review, which was published in 2018, mentioned Muslim women's specific problems with Muslim men within the Labour Party. But it didn't make any clear recommendations on what the party should do about this issue. So thus, my thesis was born. It puts the voices and experiences of Muslim women at the centre of the study and uses an intersectional theoretical framework to examine them. It asks questions of the way that the Labour Party interacts with its members and with its Muslim constituents, how it resolves conflict between members, and highlights how important parties are to encouraging diversity in political representation. Oh, sorry, I missed many slides probably. Okay, there we go. The theoretical framework I'm using to explore these issues is intersectionality. Many of you are probably very familiar with the theory, but I'll outline it briefly for those who aren't. Originating in the US, intersectionality is a theory which centres the experience of black women in its analysis and views their lives as unique and valuable in the study of power structures in society. Kimberly Crenshaw, who's credited with coining the term, used it to illustrate the social positioning of black women in US society and how their lived experience cannot be explained by simply adding together the experience of white women and black men. She argued that instead, black women's lives can only be understood by analysing how sex and race interact with one another and shaped these women's lived experiences. Using an intersectional framework gives us the tools to go beyond looking at groups as monolithic and allows us to examine the relationships within groups. It helps us to understand people's multiple characteristics and how these can interact, reinforce, and complicate power dynamics within a group. An intersectional understanding allows us to question how we think about groups and categorise people. It's not acceptable when we think intersectionally to take the most privileged group members' experience and lives as the norm. Practically, that means that when we look at Muslim women, we need to understand that their sex and their race, as well as other identities such as their religious belief, play a role in influencing how they are treated and how they behave. It also means that when we examine the behaviour of a group, such as Labour Party members, we recognise that men and women will probably have different experiences because of their different sex. And if we delve deeper, we will acknowledge that black men will have different experiences from both white men and black women. Bell Hooks writes how an understanding of intersectionality allows us to understand that a feminism which claims to speak for all women, but actually really only talks about white women's problems, only has a partial understanding of patriarchy. Similarly, Patricia Hill Collins writes of how although black organisations, including civil rights organisations in the US, claim to speak for all black people, black women have historically never held leadership positions and are therefore sidelined. In these organisations, women are not only rendered secondary and invisible, But when they do begin to question the sexism that they face within their own communities, they are confronted by opposition and hostility from their male counterparts. This reaction is often characterised by claims that by fighting gender inequality within black spaces, black women are acting in a way that is counterproductive to the wider struggle for black power. The result is that women are forced to stay silent about the oppression that they face from within their community. And they do this because they're scared that when they speak out, negative stereotypes about men within their community will be strengthened and reinforced. Therefore, an intersectional framework allows us to see that due to the relative privilege of their position, both white women and black men are able to be both oppressed and the oppressor. White women are oppressed by sexism, and ethnic minority men face racism. However, both groups have power and privilege and sometimes use it over ethnic minority women. But of course, it's not as simple as that. There have been some more recent developments in the application of the theory to political science. Melanie Hughes has carried out research which shows that in countries where there are national gender quotas for parliament and also minority quotas, ethnic minority women are able to take advantage of these. In these places, these tandem quotas, as she calls them, see dramatically higher levels of representation of ethnic minority women. This is because these women are able to satisfy both gender and ethnicity quotas while only filling one seat in the legislature. They have this sort of concentrated diversity. This means that they're seen as useful allies by majority ethnic men who are then left with more seats for themselves to fill. Therefore, ethnic minority women's unique position, which as we discussed earlier, often means that they experience complex forms of discrimination, in these circumstances are advantageous to their political representation. In the particular case of Muslim women, they are less associated with concepts of violent Islamism and are more assimilated into majority society than their male counterparts, and therefore they're favoured by parties who want to look like they're embracing diversity. This idea has been named multiple advantages by Mugir and Azil and challenges earlier intersectional work which emphasised the double jeopardy that ethnic minority women face. So in summary, I know that's a lot of information there, an intersectional theoretical framework means that we can recognise that ethnic minority women's experiences are determined by their sex and their race, and how these two, and sometimes other characteristics, interact. The impact of this is often negative. They face racism and sexism. And they're often overlooked by both women's groups and within their own ethnic minority communities. However, these women's social position and multiple characteristic also means that sometimes they experience multiple advantages, especially within the context of a political system where diversity of representation is seen as a good thing. So that begs the question, why isn't the Labour Party a place where Muslim women have multiple advantages rather than face discrimination? Why didn't the party take action when Fawzia and Shazia and other women spoke to Newsnight? So by examining the case of Muslim women in the Labour Party, we are able to question a number of different factors which relate to women's experience of Labour politics and the party's relationship with the British Muslim community, today and in the past. So these are the questions that I think the case study raises. So what are Muslim women's experiences? Why do Muslim women face discrimination from Muslim men? What's the electoral relationship between the Labour Party and the British Muslim community, and does it affect this issue? What's the role of kinship networks within the party? And what next? Looking forward, how does the Labour Party rethink its relationship with the Muslim community? Very quickly, in order to try to answer all these questions and many others, I'm using 3 different research methods. So I'm doing some website trawling. I've also carried out semi-structured, in-depth interviews with Muslim women in the Labour Party, and also a bit of autoethnography. I'm really happy to take questions on the methods at the end. and the autoethnography is probably the most interesting one, because, as I said earlier, I was a Labour councillor until very recently, and a lot of the thinking behind my PhD came from my own experiences, and a way to embrace that while also maintaining some scientific rigour was to use autoethnography as a research method. So, I'll start off with explaining what the existing literature tells us about the relationship between the Labour Party and British Muslims. Due to the colonial relationship between Britain and much of Asia, Africa and the Caribbean, ethnic minorities who have settled in the country have played a role in the electoral process since before mass migration began in the post-war era. While the Muslim community and ethnic minorities are relatively small in the UK compared to the white population, because of their geographical concentration in larger towns and cities in the northwest, the Midlands and certain parts of London, they can play a statistically significant role in the electoral process. Muslims in the UK behave very similarly to other ethnic minority communities in that they overwhelmingly support the Labour Party. We're talking huge numbers here. So in 2015, 75% of British Muslims voted for Labour. In 2017, that figure was 87%. The relationship between the South Asian Muslim community and the Labour Party is based on three factors: ideology, tradition, and the promise of greater political representation. The ideological affinity can be mostly attributed to two main policy commitments that the party has: anti-racism and support for the working classes. As Anthony Messina writes, the Labour Party is the most ideologically committed to articulating and promoting the collective interests of non-whites, of all the political parties in the UK. This ideological commitment has seen the passing of legislation such as the Race Relation Acts, which were designed to further the collective interests of the UK's growing non-white population by outlawing discrimination based on race. And this policy trajectory continued until the very end of the last Labour government, when the Equality Act 2010, which included race and religion as two of the 9 protected characteristics which are protected from discrimination, was passed. Even though this emphasis on anti-racism has been somewhat counterbalanced by measures taken by past Labour governments to restrict immigration from the Commonwealth, this has so far not diminished the party's reputation as the party of choice for Muslims and other ethnic minorities. And we'll get on to tradition and the promise of greater political representation as tools in a minute. So, back to the Newsnight interviews. Remember, the Muslim women who spoke of the experiences in the Labour Party mentioned biradari. Let's delve into those a bit further. So Muslim members of the Labour Party have long accused the party of ignoring anti-Muslim prejudice and discrimination within its ranks. Kingsley Purdham's study of Muslim Labour councillors' experiences in 2001 found that 73% were aware of discrimination within the party and 60% experienced this firsthand. Accusations of this kind date back to the early 1980s, when Muslim communities in the UK were establishing themselves, and these accusations were often accompanied by complaints from party officials of mass recruitment and so-called ethnic entryism into the party. One such example was a selection contest for the Labour parliamentary candidate in Small Heath in Birmingham in 1992. Despite the constituency having a large Kashmiri population, a white trade union candidate was selected. Local Kashmiri party members suspected that the internal process had been manipulated and local Asian candidates were disadvantaged by the tampering of trade union votes. Accusations of anti-Muslim prejudice still haunt the Labour Party today. In 2020, the relatively newly formed Labour Muslim Network released a report on Islamophobia in the party that included some damning figures on their survey of Labour Party members and supporters. The Labour Muslim Network report found that 29% of Muslim members and supporters of the Labour Party directly experienced Islamophobia, with 37% witnessing it. The current leadership of the party reacted to this report by promising to take forward the recommendations made by LMN. So, Biradari, as I said before, is a Punjabi and Urdu word for brotherhood. They are networks of mainly older Pakistani men based on kinship or village connections. During the first wave of migration to Britain, finding others who shared the same culture and heritage was important to those who found themselves in a new country. These networks were key sources of support and solidarity for these men. Once the new communities became more established, these networks began to serve a new purpose and became assets to members of the Muslim community who wanted to get involved in local politics, providing much-needed political capital during selection contests where Muslim candidates sometimes faced racism and obstacles not faced by others. As well as being networks of people from the same cultural background, these networks are also formed out of patron-client relationships. The patron-client relationship is one which is a kind of instrumental friendship between two people. It's an uneven or unequal relationship where the patron is of higher socioeconomic status and uses their resources and influence to provide benefits or protection to the client, who's of a lower socioeconomic status. So these relationships are lopsided and based upon inequality of status and reciprocity. In the case of kinship networks within the Muslim community that we're discussing, Biradari leaders gain the support of their members by providing assistance with practical arrangements and offering favours. So in a sense, these are more than kinship networks, although a shared heritage plays a really crucial role in who can be a member of a Biradari. Biradaris create systems of patronage and political power that political parties, particularly the Labour Party, have tried to use for their own electoral gain. So you might be sitting there thinking, well, this is really interesting, or maybe it's not, but what does this have to do with the Labour Party? And my answer is, well, due to the geographical concentration of South Asian Muslims, in particular areas in the UK, these Biradari networks can be really important to local politics. And of course, we know, and I was one of them, politicians want to do whatever they can to win elections. So these Biradari networks become really key to that in some areas. In the past, well, right up until now, and it's continuing, the Labour Party has been electorally successful by engaging with these networks. Biradari leaders, or as they are euphemistically known by some people as community leaders, use the client-patron relationships that they have cultivated to gain political influence. They do this by becoming so important and powerful in the local community that without their support, any person who wants to win an election can only do so with their support. Some Biradari elders claim that they control hundreds of votes through the influence that they have over heads of households in their local area. Because local electoral districts are so small and turnout for local elections is so low, these votes can be significant to the chances of a candidate winning or losing their election. Garbay's study of ethnic minority political participation in Birmingham found evidence of the influence of patronage politics in election campaigns. He wrote of how Biradari elders, having cultivated influence within their community, then become clients to white politicians who use their position to promise favours in exchange for votes that the elder claims to control. In this scenario, Biradari elders act as brokers between white politicians and their Muslim constituents. In the meantime, by doing that, they gain influence within their community due to their political connections. Therefore, personal relationships replace traditional electioneering as a method to gain votes and win elections in certain geographical areas. So this flow chart shows how these patronage relationships work. So at the top you have white politicians, and through my interviews I have evidence that these can be both men and women. They interact with Biradari leaders who they feel bring them political capital. So a white aspiring local councillor might think, okay, I really want to win my election in this ward, which has a really high population of Muslim constituents. How do I go about doing that? And they think, well, I know Mr. So-and-so, and he tells me that he knows 500 people in the local area and that he is able to put in a good word for me. So then they cultivate that relationship. Mr. So-and-so then speaks to the 60 men he knows through his networks, who then say that they can influence how their family members vote. ACTA named the political behaviour of these kinship networks, so of the Biradari networks, Biradari politicking in her 2013 work. Sorry. So Biradari politicking and Biradari networks are not necessarily always the same. While Biradari networks are needed for Biradari politicking, they don't always have a political function. Sometimes they just are men from the same cultural background who help each other out and offer each other support. So why should we care about Biradari politicking? Although electoral fraud remains rare, research commissioned by the Electoral Commission has found evidence that the influence of kinship networks, such as Biradari, is an important factor in why allegations and convictions of electoral fraud are higher in areas with high South Asian populations. But it's also really important for the Labour Party. The close link between Labour and Biradaris weakens the party in two ways. First of all, they cause the party ideological headaches. The leaders of these networks are usually older, small c conservative men. When local Labour Party politicians make appeals to these men, it can put the party's progressive platform in jeopardy. This happened in 2015, when just 3 days before the general election, the Labour Party found itself answering questions about a party campaign rally in Birmingham where men and women were seated separately. It was segregated. Instead of being able to promote its political message, the party was having to defend itself from accusations of sexism and undermining women's rights. And as you can imagine, that's not what the Labour Party wanted to be speaking about at that time. Secondly, by engaging with these networks, the Labour Party strengthens them and their leaders, because they are then able to rival the party's organisation on the local level. Already powerful Biradari elders gain further power and authority through the patronage relationships that they have cultivated with white politicians. Once they are influential enough, they can become independent actors who can break through this dynamic and basically do without the first box. So while we look at this flowchart, and obviously the arrows are pointing downwards, at the same time, the Biradari elders gain influence within their community by having that relationship with the white politicians. So two of the women, as Biradari's relationships with the party are mainly based on patronage and not ideology, the leaders, if they dislike what the Labour Party is doing locally, can tell people they have influence over to vote for someone else. Two of the women I interviewed, who are both now former Labour councillors in the North West, spoke of how local Biradari leaders were so against their reselection as Labour candidates that they either put up their own independent candidate or decided to support a Conservative Party candidate running against these women. The result was that they both lost their seats to Biradari-connected men, knowing that Labour Party members, who they were colleagues with and had previously campaigned with, had put their weight behind their opponents. One of the women said that when she complained to the local Labour MP about her treatment after she lost her seat to an independent backed by Labour members, she was told that it was just politics and that she would have to grow a thicker skin. There's been evidence of Biradari influence and the undermining of the Labour Party during general election campaigns too. The recent by-election in Batley and Spen is an example where the Labour candidate, Kim Ledbetter, was harangued by some Muslim men for her support of relationship and sex education, and the Labour Party's position on the conflict in Kashmir. She won in the end, but with a very slimmed down majority. So, we know a bit more about the way Biradari networks work and how they interact with Labour politicians at the local level. But how do they manage to become so influential within the Labour Party? So anyone here who's a Labour Party member will know how many meetings there are. You could fill your whole diary with them. But one kind of meeting is a selection meeting. And all Labour Party candidates for general and local elections are chosen by paid-up Labour Party members who live in the relevant electoral district. So it's one of the greatest responsibilities of a Labour Party member to choose who the Labour Party candidate is for the next election. So as we've already discussed, the issue of anti-Muslim prejudice we've already discussed the issue of anti-Muslim prejudice and how perhaps in response to that, some South Asian Muslims have used their networks in the community to support their political aspirations. This is possible because the way that candidates are chosen in the Labour Party is through a voting mechanism called one member, one vote. Put simply, that means that every single eligible Labour Party member gets to vote in a selection process. This means that you can get a lot of support, that if you can get a lot of your supporters turning up to a meeting, then you are in with a good chance of being chosen as the Labour candidate. Biradari-connected Labour Party members are able to ask their friends and acquaintances who live in the right electoral district to become members of the party so that they can attend a selection meeting and vote for them. And that's why local selection contests are more vulnerable than parliamentary selection contests. Quite simply, the numbers involved are just smaller. So in a selection contest for a local councillor candidate, 20 people or so could easily sway a meeting. In a parliamentary selection where you're talking hundreds of people, 20 people is not going to make so much of a difference. Right, so I've just thrown a lot of information at you about networks within the Labour Party that you've probably never heard about, and you're probably sitting there and you're thinking, well, you sort of said that there was a point to this, but really what is the point? And I guess the point is the last question on the slide, and that's why I'm interested in this issue. So who misses out when the Labour Party allows this kind of politics, this Biradari politicking, to take place within its structures? And then we're back to where we started, Muslim women. Muslim women miss out when the Labour Party allows this to happen. Armed with an intersectional understanding of how groups work, we know that Muslim women, due to their sex, are at a disadvantage within Biradari groups because they face sexism within them. Which then leads us to ask, if this is the outcome, if we know Muslim women face discrimination, why isn't the Labour Party doing anything about this? We'll have more on that in a minute. So, what did the women who I interviewed say about these experiences? Did I find evidence to support what the literature says? The issue of Biradari politicking came up in all but 2 of the interviews that I carried out. The women said that they had witnessed the organising of party members along ethnic lines during local selection meetings. In fact, 2 of the women, despite being from different ends of the country, spoke of how some men within their local parties refer to themselves as kingmakers. So sure were they of the influence that they have over local parties and the decisions made in relation to candidate selection. These women, respectively a current and former councillor from the southeast and the northwest, described how these men used their positions for business purposes to elect local councillors they thought would be easier to influence and persuade to pass their planning and licensing applications. These men spoke quite openly about the influence that they had over local Labour parties, boasting about their power and using it to ensure only compliant and sympathetic local councillors were elected. Although rejected by the majority of Muslims, caste was also a factor in deciding who could be a member of a Biradari and who couldn't. It was raised by 3 of the women that I interviewed for this research project, and it came as a surprise to me because it's not something mentioned much in the literature, not something I've experienced myself. One woman I spoke to, a former Labour local candidate, spoke of how she was excluded from being able to take a position within the local party because she wasn't from the right caste that dominated her local party. She was the only member at an AGM who put themselves forward who didn't belong to the dominant caste, and was asked by other Labour Party members at the meeting what caste she was from so they could determine her suitability for the position. This interviewee said that following this meeting, she wrote a formal complaint to the Labour Party, who refused to take any action, and ever since the complaint was shared with other Labour Party members in her party, the discriminatory behaviour towards her has worsened even further. Another interviewee described how she was always asked her caste by Labour Party members whenever she had put herself forward for a selection. They said it was something that they would have to consider when making a decision on who they would support. The concepts of honour and decency were mentioned again and again by the women that I interviewed. They spoke of how an idea of shame was used to prevent them from taking on prominent roles within the party. One spoke of how Muslim men in her local Labour Party didn't like her turning up to canvassing sessions when she first joined as a member. They used to talk amongst themselves about how she had no shame for spending time with men, even if it was for the purpose of campaigning for the Labour Party. Not a sexy pastime, I'll tell you that. When she eventually became a councillor, the same woman faced increasingly personal attacks from Muslim men in the chamber with her, complaining that the only reason that she was promoted was because she was sleeping with men within the party. Another woman spoke of how a group of men visited her parents-in-law and grandparents' homes when she first stood for local selection. They told her that she should have checked with them before joining the Labour Party, and that, quote, girls shouldn't be involved in this sort of thing. In the end, she withdrew her application after a group of 10 men came to her home to persuade her to drop out. She eventually became a councillor, and when that happened, she was told that it would be better for her to keep wearing a hijab in her leaflet photos, despite her deciding that she was no longer going to wear the headscarf. They thought she'd get more votes that way. Following this warped logic of shame and honour means that Muslim men actively organised to prevent women from standing for election, either because the women are too honourable and thus shouldn't be corrupted by politics, or because they're too dishonourable and therefore undeserving of the Labour Party and local community support. Either way, the outcome is that Muslim women who wish to stand for election for the Labour Party are prevented from doing so by powerful Muslim men within the local party. A sense of shame is also used to prevent these same women from complaining about the discrimination that they face. They are told to stay quiet. One woman described how there was an overwhelming feeling amongst Muslim members in the Labour Party that women shouldn't speak about the behaviour of Muslim men, because if these issues were made public, it would shame the community. These women are not only victims of male privilege during selection meetings via the evocation of shame as a tool of subjugation, but are also prevented from complaining about the treatment they receive through a sense of shame. So what does happen when they speak out? Not a single woman I spoke to said that they had felt supported by their local party or the National Party when they made complaints about their treatment. Their claims were hard to prove, and without the support of witnesses, who were often scared of coming forward, they were unable to make formal complaints. That's why the Labour Party's assertion and its response to the Newsnight programme, that it has a rigorous complaints process, doesn't do justice to the complexity of this issue. The Labour Party may now have a rigorous complaints process, but when the discrimination you face is systematic and hidden, how do you prove it? When witnesses are scared to come forward, how do you back up your assertions? When the Labour Party's own review says that this is an issue, but still nothing is done many years on, how do these women not lose faith? What was heartening to see is that these women did have support from individuals within the party, colleagues, friends that they had made through their activism, who supported them on a personal basis. but were not able to offer the institutional action needed to tackle this issue effectively. Right, so I hope I've been able to take you through the history of the relationship between the Labour Party and the South Asian British Muslim community. Hopefully I've been able to show you that the way that the party currently interacts with the community through Biradari networks isn't doing the party any favours or the women in the community any good. Part of my thesis is making recommendations to the party. Whether the party takes them on board is another matter, but as someone who dedicated 8 years of her life to the party and cares deeply about it, I'm going to make the recommendations anyway. Part of these recommendations are going to be about how the party engages with the Muslim community. So Biradari networks have served the party really well. It does very well electorally where these Biradari networks are strong. But there are downsides to this, electorally and ideologically for the Labour Party. Therefore, it needs to move away from relying on these networks, and it needs to try to cultivate new electoral relationships with the community. That means interacting with young people and with Muslim women directly, talking to them about the issues that matter to them, engaging them as equal stakeholders and voters with a say. It also means recognising the role that Muslim women activists within the party could play if given half a chance, nurturing them, encouraging them, taking their concerns seriously. If the party does that, it might just live up to the title that it's given itself as the Party of Equality. If it doesn't, then Muslim women might just walk away. That's it.
Okay, so could I have any hands up if anyone wants to ask Farah a question? Don't be shy. Yeah. Yeah, if you wait for the microphone so everyone can hear.
Are we taking one?
Oh, you go for that one and then we'll take some others in.
That's a really interesting question. I think that local parties know what they're doing. I don't think they're under any illusions of the people that they're dealing with or what's going on with their local parties. I've spoken to people who are involved in sort of, lots of acronyms, but LCFs and who are local councillors, and they will say, yeah, we know that these men aren't the nicest people. We know that we're undermining democracy within our local party, but what can we do that wins us votes? And to be honest, it makes sense, right? The Labour Party is a political party. It's there to win elections. That's its whole purpose. But I think the Labour Party can do that better. It can do that in a different way. Sorry, I keep turning it off. I don't think it's for the National Party to tell local parties what to do, because I think they know what they're doing is not good for them long term.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for your talk, and I'm curious, and you can tell me that I might be asking you a question that you can't answer, but is this dynamic a specifically Labour Party dynamic, or are the other parties also working through these kind of local influential, is it beer? I'm butchered if I try to say it, but community leaders in the same way that Labour Party activists feel compelled to?
So because of the electoral relationship between the Labour Party and Muslims, there are just a lot more Muslims in the Labour Party, because it is seen as the party of choice for ethnic minorities, but also for the Muslim community in particular. So I think it is a particular Labour Party issue. That's not to say it doesn't exist within certain areas in other parties, probably the Conservative Party in certain areas, and I have seen that take place, but I think it's less systematic, and it just happens less, a fewer numbers. But there's no research, I don't think there's any research been done on it.
About 5 minutes, so we can fit in a few more, I think. Can I see any more hands?
We've got Lindsay here.
Head over here, and then I'll sort of move across.
Okay.
Oh, Lindsay's already got the mic. Let's take two. So let's go here, and then we'll go Lindsay, seeing as she's ready to go as well.
Thanks very much, Farah. That was really interesting. I just wanted to ask you if you've come across this phenomenon. It's actually, I don't know that it is a phenomenon. It's anecdotal. It's hearsay. I was a Labour Party member till 2019. But you said that who misses out from biradari politicking, and you said it's Muslim women. And I'm wondering whether it's actually Muslim women who care about change, who care about gender equality, that are missing out. Because in Birmingham, what I heard through the local party networks was that from 2018, certain women got elected as councillors, as Labour councillors, and that they had the backing of the biradari, of the local biradari networks. And certainly, I haven't done any work on it. I just happen to kind of think, I'll look at these women on the council website, see who they are, what are they doing, and actually they're people who keep their heads well below the parapet. They don't make any statements on any issues that should be of importance to Muslims or to Muslim women. And so I don't know if you've come across that, and whether you can put any kind of basis to it.
Actually, my question is a bit similar, because I'm also interested in this idea about Muslim women walking away. And I think it's similar to what Kashid's asking in terms of, Muslim women who care about change and progress. What are the women in your interviews telling you about what they're going to do now? Are they disaffected? Are they going to disengage electorally? Are they going to disengage with the Labour Party specifically? Or kind of what are the broader consequences? What happens next to these women?
Those are really good questions. So there's obviously there are Muslim women in the Labour Party who are elected to positions, who do get through these selection processes and who do get elected, and I was one of them. But there are also women who are, so Labour Party is really fixated on numbers, and there are people in the audience who've done a lot more work on this than me, but all women shortlist, the Labour Party can point to the figures and it can say, but we do have Muslim women elected, we can't be that bad. But as Kashid was saying, when you look at the Muslim women who are elected, a lot of them who do have the support of these networks would be wives of existing councillors, daughters of existing councillors, women who might be seen to be more compliant and more influenced. But that's not, obviously when you say that sounds really horrible, because these women are probably formidable in themselves, but they don't show that in the work that they do, as far as I can see. So there are Muslim women elected in the Labour Party, nationally and locally, but they are often, where these biradari networks are strong, they can often be women who are supported by these networks because they need to find some women, because the Labour Party has rules about women's representation locally. So they might just be people who are chosen because they fit that criteria of being a woman. And what Lindsay, that is really interesting. And so these women I interviewed, I don't know if I think it's probably more for historians than political scientists, but to love your subject matter is like these women are formidable. They are amazing women. The stories that they tell and what they've been through, to just, when I think about it, I'm like, you go through all of this so you can be a local councillor. Like, it's, and I was one myself, but you know, they go through all of this just so they can knock on some doors and do some casework, and they are fantastic. And the Labour Party really risks losing, you know, fantastic women by not taking this issue on. And some of the women go, so Shazia, who spoke to BBC Newsnight, I haven't interviewed her myself, but I know she's now a Conservative councillor in Peterborough. And some of the women that I've spoken to have since not got re-elected because of some Biradari influence and some for other reasons. And you know, they've just said that they're going to walk away from politics on its own. And then there are some women who are like, no, I've fought so hard, I've come through all of this, I'm staying here, this is my party, because they believe in it. There's all this literature about why people join political parties, and what really came across in my interviews, which supports what the literature says, is that there's this incentive to make change. Like, you join a political party not for the prestige or you know, or anything else, but you join it because you believe in that party. For lots of people, they believe in that party as a mechanism for change in the country that they, you know, and the change that they want to see. And some of these women are so committed, and they feel like they've been through so much. They're just like, no, I'm going to dig my heels in, I'm going to carry on, I'm going to keep the allies that I've got, and yeah, they're going to stay. But whether they go any, you know, whether they're able to go any further is another question.
We have a question just at the back there.
Thank you. I was very persistent and left my hand up
Yeah.
the whole time, so thank you for catching my eye. My name is Zainab Asanramu, and I am here with Hannah from the organisation Elect Her. And it's really interesting to listen to your lecture. Thank you so much for pouring so much into it. The question that I have is around the advice that you would give or have given to women on how to navigate these systems, because a lot of the women that come through Elect Her, there have been quite a few who have exactly experienced everything that you've outlined, and sometimes myself and Hannah are stumped as to how to help them move forward. Elect Her is an organisation that's working to get more women into elected office across the party, across different parties, and so we are coming across women who are experiencing this, especially in the last election that just went, the last locals, and we would love to know how best to support women to kind of, is there anywhere we can direct them to? Are there any networks, for example?
So the Muslim Women's Network is probably the best organisation for them to go to. What I really was hoping that through my research process, what I was hoping that I'd find was that there were these like underground networks of Muslim women, like a huge WhatsApp group or something. And I was really, you know, quite upset that there wasn't. Like, these women are really, like, I spoke to a lot of women, and they're all dotted around the country, but they don't necessarily know about each other, and they're not making those connections. That is something that, you know, once I eventually finish my PhD, you know, in 20 years or something, I would like to do something to create some sort of network of Muslim women, maybe, you know, at party conference or something to get them together. But I think that informal networking can be a real source of strength, and what people really underestimate, like advice that I give to new councillors, whether they're from the Labour Party or Muslim women or not, is find your allies. Like, find the people in the next meeting that are going to say, yeah, Farah's made a really good point, I support what she's going to say, even if I said something really, you know, stupid or you know, nothing very insightful. I think people just really need to find their allies in those situations, because politics is all about the numbers, and it's just all about looking like you have loads of people who think you're saying really smart things. So that would be my main piece of advice.
We have gone a little over, so we should probably stop there. If we could all join me in saying thank you once again to Farah.